Keith Richards bet Eric Clapton $3,000 he couldn't write a riff in 8 minutes. What Clapton created was legendary. It was March 23, 1990, and the Backstage area of Madison Square Garden was buzzing with the nervous energy that always preceded major rock concerts. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony had just concluded, and some of the biggest names in music history were gathered in the VIP area, sharing war stories and catching up on decades of friendship, rivalry, and mutual respect. The evening had been particularly memorable, with performances that reminded everyone why rock and roll had become the most influential musical force of the 20th century. Eric had performed Lila with an all-star band that included members of the newly inducted Four Tops, and the energy in the venue had been electric. Backstage, the atmosphere was relaxed but charged, with legends from different eras of rock music mingling and celebrating their shared legacy. The conversations flowing through the VIP area covered everything from recording techniques to tour stories to the evolution of rock music over the decades. There was a sense of history being made, of witnessing a gathering of musical titans that might never happen again in quite the same way. Eric Clapton was standing near the bar, nursing a Coca-Cola and chatting with Bonnie Raitt about the evening's performances, when Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones approached with that distinctive swagger that had been his trademark for over 25 years. Keith had just finished his own set with the Stones, a blistering performance of Start Me Up that had reminded everyone why the Rolling Stones were still considered one of the greatest rock bands in the world. Keith's energy was infectious, and Eric could see that the Rolling Stones guitarist was in one of those moods where his natural charisma and competitive spirit were operating at full power. Keith had always thrived in environments like this, where the cream of rock music gathered to celebrate and, inevitably, to measure themselves against each other. Keith was in one of his more talkative moods, energized by the evening's celebration of rock music and perhaps by the few drinks he'd enjoyed during the ceremony. The Rolling Stones guitarist had always had a complex relationship with Eric, part mutual admiration, part competitive rivalry that stemmed from their parallel rises to fame in the British rock scene of the 1960s. "Slow hand," Keith called out, using Eric's nickname as he approached. "Hell of a speech tonight, though I still think they should have inducted the Stones 5 years earlier than they did." Eric replied, "Keith, you guys were practically founding members of rock and roll. They should have inducted you the day the Hall of Fame opened." Keith raised his glass in a mock toast. "Damn right, but enough politics. I want to talk about something more important, guitar playing." Eric raised an eyebrow. Conversations about guitar playing with Keith Richards tended to go in interesting directions, often involving debates about technique, authenticity, and the relative merits of different musical approaches. "What's on your mind?" Eric asked. Keith took a sip of his drink and looked at Eric with that mischievous expression that usually preceded either a great story or a provocative challenge. "I've been thinking about what separates the great guitarists from the merely good ones," Keith said, "and I think it comes down to one thing: riffs. Not solos, not fancy finger-picking, not technical wizardry. Riffs. The ability to create a musical phrase that gets into people's heads and never leaves." Eric nodded thoughtfully. Keith had a point. Some of the most memorable moments in rock music history were built around iconic riffs. Keith's own work on songs like Satisfaction and Start Me Up, Jimmy Page's contributions to Whole Lotta Love and Black Dog, and Eric's own riff-driven songs like Layla and Sunshine of Your Love. "I don't disagree," Eric said. "A great riff is the foundation of a great rock song." "Exactly," Keith continued, warming to his theme. "But here's the thing. I think the ability to create riffs is something you either have or you don't. It's not something you can learn or develop over time. It's pure instinct." Eric found himself disagreeing with Keith's assessment, but he was curious to hear where this conversation was leading. "What do you mean by instinct?" Eric asked. I mean the ability to reach for your guitar and immediately find something that rocks, something that makes people want to move, something that sounds like it's always existed but nobody's ever heard it before, Keith explained. Great riffs come from the gut, not from the head. Eric considered this perspective. While he appreciated the value of spontaneous creativity, his own approach to music had always been more methodical, more carefully crafted. Even his most famous riffs had usually been developed through extensive experimentation and refinement. I think great riffs can come from different places, Eric replied diplomatically. Some are spontaneous, others are more carefully constructed. Keith shook his head emphatically. Nah, that's where you're wrong, Eric. The constructed ones, the ones you work on and polish, they might be technically perfect, but they don't have that magic, that immediate impact that makes a riff truly great. Eric felt a slight challenge in Keith's words, but he was accustomed to friendly musical debates and didn't take offense. Keith had always been opinionated about music, and his success with the Rolling Stones had certainly given him credibility in discussions about what made rock music work. So you're saying that all great riffs are spontaneous? Eric asked. I'm saying that the truly legendary ones are, the ones that define careers, that become part of rock history. Those come from inspiration, not from calculation. Before Eric could respond, Keith's expression shifted, and Eric recognized the look that preceded one of Keith's more outrageous proposals.
Tell you what, Slowhand, Keith said, using Eric's nickname again. How about we put this theory to the test? What do you have in mind? Eric asked, though he had a feeling he might already know. A little wager, Keith said with a grin. I bet you $3,000 that you can't create a truly great riff, something legendary, something that would be worthy of a classic rock song, in 8 minutes. Eric was intrigued despite himself. 8 minutes was an extremely short time frame for creating something substantial, but the challenge appealed to his competitive nature. What exactly constitutes a truly great riff? Eric asked, wanting to understand the parameters of Keith's challenge. Something that rocks immediately, Keith explained. Something that makes people want to move when they hear it. Something that sounds like it belongs on a classic rock album. And most importantly, something that neither of us has ever heard before. It has to be completely original. Eric thought about the challenge. 8 minutes was indeed a very short time, but he had been playing guitar for over 25 years, and he had a vast vocabulary of musical ideas and techniques to draw upon. And if I do create something that meets your criteria? Eric asked. Then I pay you $3,000 and admit that maybe great riffs can be created through focused effort rather than just spontaneous inspiration. And if I don't? Then you pay me $3,000 and acknowledge that the greatest rock riffs come from the gut, not from the brain. Eric considered the proposition. $3,000 wasn't a huge amount of money for either of them, but the philosophical implications of the bet were more significant. This was really a challenge about different approaches to creativity, about whether great music required inspiration or whether it could be created through skill and determination. All right, Eric said, extending his hand. You've got a deal. As they shook hands, word of the bet began to spread through the VIP area. Other musicians gathered around, curious to see what would happen when one of rock's greatest guitarists attempted to create a legendary riff under pressure. The news traveled quickly through the interconnected network of musicians, producers, and industry insiders who were scattered throughout the Backstage area. Within minutes, what had started as a casual conversation between two rock legends had become the evening's main attraction. Slash from Guns N' Roses appeared with a guitar case, having heard about the challenge through the Backstage grapevine. Heard you might need an instrument, Eric. You can use my Les Paul if you want, he offered, clearly excited to be part of what was shaping up to be a historic musical moment. Eddie Van Halen, who had been chatting with other inductees nearby about the future of guitar music, approached the growing crowd with obvious interest. What's all the excitement about? He asked, though the energy in the room made it clear that something significant was about to happen.
Eric's about to try to create rock history in 8 minutes, Keith explained, clearly enjoying the attention their bet was attracting and the way it was turning into a spontaneous showcase of musical talent. Soon, the backstage area had transformed into an impromptu performance space, with some of the biggest names in rock music gathering to witness Eric's attempt to meet Keith's challenge. Joe Walsh was there, along with members of Aerosmith who had performed earlier in the evening. The assembled crowd represented decades of rock music evolution, from the British invasion through punk, metal, and everything in between. The impromptu nature of the gathering added to its significance. This wasn't a planned event or a publicity stunt. It was a genuine moment of musical competition and creativity happening organically among peers who understood and respected each other's talents. Eric accepted Slash's guitar and took a few minutes to adjust to the instrument's feel and sound. It was a beautiful 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard, the kind of guitar that seemed designed for creating powerful rock riffs. "Ready when you are, Eric," Keith said, checking his watch. 8 minutes starting now. What happened next was a masterclass in creative pressure and musical instinct. Eric began by simply playing with the guitar's sound, experimenting with different pickup settings, and getting a feel for how the instrument responded to his touch. For the first minute, he didn't play anything that could be considered a riff, just single notes, chord fragments, and explorations of the guitar's sonic possibilities. Keith watched with the confident expression of someone who expected to win an easy bet. In his experience, great riffs came from sudden inspiration, not from methodical experimentation. But as Eric continued playing, something interesting began to happen. His random experimentation was gradually becoming more focused, more purposeful. He was beginning to discover musical ideas that sparked his interest and demanded further development. Around the 2-minute mark, Eric played a simple 3-note phrase that caught the attention of several musicians in the crowd. It wasn't a complete riff yet, but it had something, a quality that suggested it could be developed into something significant. Eric repeated the phrase several times, each time with slight variations, gradually building complexity and emotional weight. The watching musicians could see that he was onto something, that the random experimentation was giving way to genuine musical development. By the 4-minute mark, Eric had expanded the 3-note phrase into a complete musical statement that had the driving rhythm and melodic memorability that characterized great rock riffs. But he wasn't finished yet. For the next 2 minutes, Eric refined and perfected the riff, adding subtle variations that made it more dynamic and emotionally compelling. He experimented with different rhythmic emphases, tried the riff in different octaves, and added complementary phrases that enhanced its impact. The assembled musicians were beginning to nod their heads in time with Eric's playing, a sure sign that the riff was achieving the kind of immediate physical impact that Keith had described as essential to great rock music. At the 6-minute mark, Eric had what was undeniably a complete and powerful riff. But instead of stopping, he continued developing it, adding layers and variations that demonstrated the full potential of what he had created. When Keith called time at exactly 8 minutes, Eric played the riff through one final time, from beginning to end, with all the power and conviction of a classic rock performance. The backstage area erupted in applause. Even Keith Richards was nodding his head appreciatively, clearly impressed by what Eric had accomplished under such intense time pressure. "Well," Eric asked, setting down the guitar and looking at Keith, "what's the verdict?" Keith was quiet for a moment, clearly processing what he had just witnessed. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a wad of cash, and counted out 30 $100 bills. "That," Keith said, handing Eric the money, "was a genuine rock riff. Hell, it was better than genuine. It was inspired." Eddie Van Halen spoke up from the crowd. "Eric, you need to record that. That riff could anchor an entire album." Slash nodded in agreement. "I've never heard anything quite like it. It's got this driving quality that makes you want to keep listening." Over the next several minutes, various musicians took turns playing Eric's riff on different guitars, each discovering new aspects of its musical potential. The consensus was unanimous. Eric had created something special, something that met Keith's criteria for a legendary riff. "I have to admit," Keith said to Eric, "you proved something important tonight. I thought great riffs could only come from spontaneous inspiration, but you showed that focused creativity can produce something just as powerful." Eric smiled. "I appreciate that, Keith, but honestly, I think we were both right. The riff did come from a kind of inspiration. It just took some focused effort to discover what that inspiration wanted to become." The riff that Eric created that night was later recorded as the foundation for a song called Madison Square Garden Blues, which appeared on his 1992 album, Unplugged. The song became one of the most popular tracks on the album, and the riff itself is now studied in guitar schools around the world as an example of perfect rock composition. But perhaps more importantly, the challenge from Keith Richards taught Eric something valuable about his own creative process. He learned that he could trust his instincts even under pressure, that his years of experience and musical knowledge could combine with spontaneous creativity to produce something genuinely original and powerful. Years later, when young guitarists would ask Eric about developing their riff-writing abilities, he would often tell them about the night Keith Richards bet against him at Madison Square Garden. "Keith taught me that there are different paths to the same destination," Eric would say. "Some riffs come from pure inspiration, others from focused effort. The important thing is to trust your musical instincts and be brave enough to follow them wherever they lead." The $3,000 that Eric won that night was donated to music education programs in New York City schools. But the riff he created became something much more valuable, proof that great music can emerge from the combination of skill, experience, and the courage to take creative risks. Keith Richards later said in interviews that losing that bet was one of the most educational experiences of his career, because it taught him to respect different approaches to creativity and to never underestimate the power of focused musical effort. "I learned something important that night," Keith said in a Rolling Stone interview years later. "Great music doesn't care how it gets created. Whether it comes from inspiration or perspiration, what matters is whether it moves people." And Eric's riff that night, hell, it moved everybody in the room. The Madison Square Garden riff, as it came to be known among musicians, stands as a reminder that creativity can flourish under pressure, that great art can emerge from focused effort, and that sometimes the best way to prove a point is to pick up your guitar and let the music speak for itself. Sometimes 8 minutes is enough to create something that lasts forever.